Um, Junyoung Lee is a Korean American theologian. He developed an entire marginal theology in between, in both, and beyond. The in-between stage is what Victor Turner, a British cultural anthropologist, called liminality. As Lee described in his autobiography, after living in the US for many years, he went back to his native North Korea for a visit. While in his hometown, he was faced with this odd sense of familiarity yet strangeness. The town in which he grew up in had completely changed. His family home had been demolished. There was virtually no trace of the time he spent there. While he looked like them, he spoke fluent Korean, the people did not accept him as one of their own. He was an Americanized Korean to them. In the United States, Americans do not accept him as one of their own either. In the years from 1950 onwards that he had lived in the US, he was seen as a foreigner, no matter where he went. People would ask him, "Where are you from? And when are you going back to Korea?" Lee felt he did not belong in the US, yet he knew that North Korea was no longer home for him either. So he was in a state of liminality, neither here nor there, betwixt and between North Korea and the United States. And Lee called this an in-between stage, or what Victor Turner called liminality. Over time, Lee learned to embrace his cultural identity in its entirety. While he was not seen as fully Korean in North Korea and not seen as fully American in the US, he was both Korean and American. He learned to acknowledge and appreciate both his Korean and American aspects of his identity. He called this an in-both stage. These are the concepts I'll be using in this webinar: liminality, or in between and in both stages. A clarification on some of the labels and terms are in order. When I use the term Asian Americans, I'm referring to Asians who have been in the US for many years and consider the US their home, or Asians who were born here or the families have been here for many generations. The latter is called Asian ethnic. Asian ethnics are Asian American of second and later generations. In other words, when I say Asian American, I do not mean recently arrived Asian immigrants who have not acclimated to the American context yet. Furthermore, we cannot ascribe Asian Americans in a monolithic manner. In other words, there are no generic Asian American or generic Asian American Catholics. But all Asian American, including Asian American Catholics, experience to varying degree a sense that we are foreigners in our own country. This is called perpetual foreigner stereotype. For the first topic, historical background of Asian American Catholic experience is still work in progress. Depending on how you count them, there are 53 countries and territories in Asia, and at least 15 countries and territory in Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia combined. You won't find any volume that covers such a large pan-ethnic groups, either within the category Asian American or that of Pacific Islanders. There are a few books and articles that are about specific ethnic groups such as Vietnamese, Korean, or Filipino Catholics, but there is no single text that encompasses the history of multiple Asian ethnic Catholic groups in the US. So let me begin by providing some stats about Asian American Catholic. You look at this graph generated in 2015, it shows that Christian comprise the largest religious group in the world. That's 2015. Many demographers predict the Muslim population will overtake Christians soon, because the average Muslim family has more children than Christians do. And also the rapid decrease of number of Christians in Europe. To give you a perspective, there are presently more people who attend church in communist China alone than all of Europe. The next graph shows Asian Pacific Islanders by ethnic origins. You can see here the Chinese represent the largest group in 2018. The Asian Indian are rapidly catching up. They may have already surpassed the Chinese. If not, they will soon. And while Chinese Asian Indian comprise the largest Asian American ethnic group, in terms of Catholics, Filipino represent the largest, overwhelming majority of Catholics in the United States, followed by Vietnamese and Chinese. And this particular graph I'm going to show is to show religious affiliation Asian Americans. A large percent, the majority are Christian. What this tells us is that even though Asia is predominantly non-Christian, most of the people who immigrated here are Christian. That's the only way we can have such a large percentage of Christian who are Asian American in the United States. So they are, among the immigrants, the large percentage Christian, large percentage of Catholics. So I want to begin in the distinguishing feature of Asian American community with this, with a description of Asian family dinner thing, because this is not family. This picture of our lunch when I was visiting scholar at the Chinese University, Hong Kong. In an Asian family, you won't have a lazy Susan in the middle of the table. I mean, like an American family, you pass the dishes along. In American family, if you, let's say that a bowl of fried chicken come to you, you normally eat 2 pieces of fried chicken. You put 2 pieces of fried chicken on your plate and you pass it to the next person. But you don't do that in Asian family, especially in East Asian family. If the bowl of fried chicken come along, even there are plenty of food to go around, you only put one piece of chicken on your plate and pass it along. You can always have second or third. The reason is you always think about others first, not about yourself. That sense of community is deeply embedded in the culture itself. This is especially true in the poor family. You think about the kids. They need to eat the better part of the chicken because they are growing. You as adult do not need to do that, and things like that. The communal element centered on family is a distinguishing characteristic of Asian American communities. If you understand what goes on at the dinner table in Asian family household, you will understand the communal element of Asian American Catholic engagement in Marian devotion, novenas, benedictions, and so on. My good friend, Dr. Jonathan Tan, the Archbishop Paul Hallinan Professor of Catholic Study in KC Reserve University, has written a marvelous article on Asian Americans, Marian devotion and ritual practice. In it, he argues that Asian American Catholics have continued to maintain and participate in Marian devotional ritual in part because these devotional practices not only nurture their faith and spiritual life, but also shape their religion, their religious, cultural, and transnational identity within the context of the multicultural, multiracial setting of the US. This identity formation is enhanced by Asian American Catholic pilgrimages to places like the Basilica of National Shrine of Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., or to the Grotto, the National Sanctuary of Our Lady of Sorrow in Portland, Oregon, and other pilgrimage sites. The communal feature of Marian devotion that Asian American Catholics found meaningful, in part, come from the European Catholicism. For example, the idea that Mary is not only the mother of Jesus, but also our mother, is meaningful not only to the medieval European Catholicism, but also within the communal mindset of contemporary Asian American Catholics. Mary is not simply a member of the Holy Family. She's also a member of our family. This idea of Mary as a member of one's own family goes back to 30 Catholic countries in Europe during the Middle Ages. Many of the churches and cathedrals built in Europe during that time were dedicated to Mary, but they did not call it Mary. They call it Notre Dame, Our Lady. She's Our Lady, a member of our family. Mary is our mother as well. She's our sister. Mary is Our Lady of Valentini, Our Lady of China. She's Our Lady of Lavon. She's Our Lady of Antipolo, just to give you an example. American Catholics, by and large, have lost a sense of community. I maintain that American Catholics are more Protestant than they are Catholics. Many American Catholics are quite individualistic. The Jesus and me spirituality, with little or no connection with the community, has taken over by many American Catholics. Most judge community in terms of what is good for me and my family, rather than what is good for the community as a whole. And one of the contributions Asian American Catholics can give to the American Catholic Church is this sense of community rooted in the Catholic principle of communion. I don't have a whole lot of time to do the Marian piety stuff, but let me just say that Chinese ancestral veneration, which was banned in the Catholic Church for over 2 centuries, is now permitted if it harmonizes with the authentic spirit of the liturgy. So you can see today in the church, see ancestral veneration similar to like communion saint in Catholic tradition. You will find veneration of one ancestor celebrated within the Catholic Church, not only Asia, but also in the US. So in the picture on the left, you see Archbishop Blaise Capuche of Chicago leading Chinese rites of veneration of ancestor within the context of Mass at St. Teresa Chinese Catholic Church. And on the right, you see Catholic, Chinese Catholic welcoming the New Year in San Francisco. I don't think that's a cathedral. I may be wrong, it doesn't look like it. But anyway, so you see those type of practices that are allowed today. And let me turn to one of the main topics of this webinar, racialized aspect of multicultural celebration. In the politics of multicultural liturgy and celebration, Asian Americans are expected to put on Asian culture on display, such as bringing ethnic foods, performing ethnic dances, and putting on ethnic costume as a way of representing Asian culture and tradition. This sort of celebration is especially meaningful for the immigrant community. Here we have see a photo of people who attended the Korean Mass at St. Joseph Cathedral in Hartford, Connecticut. Next 2 pictures from 2009 Korean New Year party, New Year celebration. So in this picture, you see Sotan, the leader of the Korean community, with Archbishop Menzel. I don't know the lady next to him, but I think the person next to the lady is none other than Monsignor McCarthy. This kind of celebration affirms the cultural identity of the immigrant group and provide ethnic reinforcement in passing down their cultural heritage to the next generation. It celebrates the Asianness of the Asian American identity. As such, it is not specifically an Asian American celebration, as it does not speak to the quintessential experience that Asian Americans struggle with day in and day out. For Asians who have lived in the US for many years, those who are born here and raised here, especially those whose family have been here for many generations, our Asianness is often exoticized to the extent that we are seen as non-Americans. Here lies the difference between white Americans celebrating their ethnicity and Asian American celebrating asked to do the same. This is a picture from Australia. You can find similar thing happening, multicultural celebration in the US as well. I didn't have time to look for the one in the US, but just pretend that they're in the US. I like this picture because they have picture people in different costume from Europe, from China, from Africa, and so on and so forth. So ethnicity for Euro-American is optional trait. One day can be invoked in certain time and ignored at others. Like the Irish American who celebrate the Irishness on St. Patrick's Day and simply slip into whiteness the rest of the year without having to say a word. This differs from experienced racial minorities whose physical visibility prevent us from easily setting aside our race or ethnicity. Mary Waters wrote this book called Ethnic Option. She said white Americans can invoke their ethnicity when they desire to do so, and ignore it whenever they wish. Like other people of color, Asian American do not have an ethnic option. Our race has been assigned to us. We cannot get out of it, no matter how much we may choose not to identify ourselves in racial or ethnic terms. And this is clearly seen in the classic example of racial microaggression. Almost every Asian in the United States have been asked, where are you from? This question is often posed out of curiosity and with no malice intent. But it becomes a racial microaggression when the questioner is not satisfied with our answer and counters, where are you really from? I remember when I was undergrad at USC, University of Southern California, and I invited my roommate, who is not Catholic, to Catholic Mass. And so we went to the walk in the vestibule, and there was a Green Party there. And a lady asked my roommate, where are you from? He said, we're from USC. And she said, no, where are you really from? He said, I'm from San Francisco. No, where are you really from? I mean, that's just rude. I mean, just accept what he says and move on. I mean, by the way, my roommate was sixth generation Chinese American. There are very few of them around. His family was probably in the United States longer than the person who asked him, where are you really from? And yet, he was treated as a foreigner. So it doesn't matter how long we've been here. People only look at what we look like, and we assume that we're a foreigner. So anyway, the question, where are you really from, is a loaded question because the word really in the question assumes, even if the questioner is unaware of it, that Asian Americans are the others, and that we cannot be real Americans. Most Americans like to pin us down as either Asian or American, rather than acknowledge the liminal space that Asian American actually occupy. Because of our experience of marginalization, we have experienced the in-betweenness of our identity. We are recognized neither as fully Asian in Asia, nor fully American in the US, yet we are both Asian and American. And that's okay, but that's who we are. Although many of us are proud of a hybrid identity in cross-cultural encounters, whether in church or society, the Americanness of our identity is often overlooked, and we find ourselves expelled to Asia. And this is the problem with multicultural mass for Asian ethnics. Again, Asian ethnics are Asian American second and later generation. For them, multicultural mass, as we celebrate it today, contribute to the stereotype of Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners by highlighting only the Asianness. For many Asian ethnics, the desire to reclaim a distinctive element of the Asian tradition is seen at odds with their desire to be recognized as fully American. In other words, they are caught between a rock and a hard place. If they want to be accepted as American, they have to downplay the Asian tradition. And this can engender an ambivalent feeling about their own Asian tradition, or it may even lead to hatred of their culture and tradition. Many Asian ethnics, however, do not want to become white. Simply sending them to English-speaking mass, for example, will not keep many of them in the church. They do not want to completely renounce their Asian heritage to become what is pejorative known as bananas, white on the inside, yellow on the outside. Neither do they want to be identified only by the Asian heritage. They are, after all, Americans, even if they don't have white skin and light hair. In other words, we are good at celebrating where are you really from type of liturgy. We are not good at meeting Asian Americans at their points of needs. We are good at meeting Asian Americans at the ethnic level, but we do not know how to meet them at the racial level. And this is the same with African Americans and other racial minority population. We never really celebrate the lives of Asian Americans as we actually experience our lives in the US. Now, don't get me wrong. The celebration of Asianness in multicultural liturgy is necessary and important, not only for Asian immigrants, but also for Asian ethnics. They need to be reminded that the Asianness of their identity is something that is given to them. They did not choose to become Asian. Often, the most important part of our identity and our relationship are not those that we choose, but those with which we are born and given to us. But the celebration of Asianness needs to be balanced with the celebration of authentically Asian American experience. The question is, how do we celebrate multicultural liturgy by affirming the liminal, the in-both, and in-beyond spaces that Asian Americans actually occupy? In ritualistic culture and religion, the space and time of liminality is often viewed as sacred space and sacred time. Indeed, the liminal person, himself or herself, is often seen as sacred. Instead of simply putting on ethnic costume, shouldn't we also have liturgy or celebration that tries to connect with the in-between that every Asian American has experienced, the betwixt in between Asianness and Americanness, the experience of neither here nor there, and connect them with the categories and values of our Catholic tradition that tells us that it is often in liminal space and time that we encounter the presence of the divine more vividly, that we are more perceptible to the promptings of the Spirit heard deep within the recesses of our own hearts. And this cannot be done in a top-down approach, especially if people at the top are non-Asian Americans. There must be opportunity for Asian Americans to come together for faith sharing, Bible study, retreats, and so on. It's out of that common experiences that an authentically Asian American Catholic liturgy can be developed. It must come from bottom up, from those who actually experience life as Asian Americans. The top-down approach can do more damage than help. The theological and liturgical training of priests and lay leader can guide Asian Americans in the process of celebrating their experiences, even though their main task is to listen. And there are many biblical passages that relate Asian American experience of in-betweenness or liminality. The Bible is full of story about liminality. In the Old Testament, the story of Elijah's flight into the wilderness after he was being thrown out of town by the pagan queen Jezebel for preaching against her false prophets. Elijah was in a state of liminality when he hid in the caves, fearful for his life. In the New Testament, the incarnation itself is a liminal experience for the infant Jesus and his parents. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus underwent a liminal journey when he experienced 3 great temptations in the desert before beginning his ministry. Indeed, Jesus is presented throughout the New Testament as a marginal man par excellence. While there is a place for celebrating multicultural celebration that put Asian culture on display, if we exclusively celebrate Asian culture and tradition as a representation of diversity, we are actually feeding into the stereotype that Asian Americans are forever foreigners. This stereotype does not affect white folks, many of whom plan this sort of liturgy, because their Americanness will never be called into question. But it has had harmful effects on the lives of Asians living in the US. This foreignness trope has resulted in ethnic slur and racial epithet hurled at Asian kids growing up in the US. And every Asian kid went through that, including myself. And it's intimately linked to almost every crime committed against Asian Americans. It has something to do with the fact that we are foreigner, we are not American, we are the outlandish folks. This persistent stereotype is a manifestation of a social sin at a structural and systemic level, passed down from one generation to the next. It shows up in overt anti-Asian racism during times of crisis. And this historical form of racism and xenophobia continue to persist to this day, as COVID-19 is associated with anyone who looks Chinese. In East Asian society, even before COVID-19, many people wear masks when air pollution reaches a dangerous level, or when they have allergy, or when they feel like they're about to catch a cold. They wear masks in order not to spread their germs to others. Remember the meal etiquette. Asians generally think about others for themselves. It's in our cultural upbringing. I'm not saying Asian culture is superior. I'm just pointing out the communal aspect of that culture. At the start of the pandemic, some of our many health officials in the US were telling Americans that wearing masks doesn't protect us from catching the virus. Notice thinking here. I focus on individual rather than communal. The mask doesn't protect you from catching the virus. The mask may not protect us from catching the virus, but it does prevent us from spreading the virus if we have it. This communal element did not register automatically, even with these health officials. During that time, Asian American woman wearing a mask on New York subway train was attacked by another woman who assumed that she had COVID-19. A month later, another Asian American woman was punched in the face by another woman because she didn't wear a mask. So it's damn you do, damn you don't. In other words, you look Asian, the assumption is that you must be a carrier of COVID-19. Jeff Yang, who is a feature writer and frequent contributor to CNN Opinion, tweeted what he called his first breeding wild Asian moment. And he said he went out for grocery, and an older masked white woman passed by the line, shouted "F you" at him for no apparent reason. As he stared at her, he pulled off her mask, coughed directly at him, turned on her heel, and walked off. Now, this woman not only harassed Mr. Yang, but also committed a racial incident because coughing at and spitting upon another person, which posed public health concern, can be classified as either hate incident or hate crime. This is by no means an isolated incident. This type of incident has become frequent enough to trigger a social media hashtag, coughing while Asian. Anti-Asian sentiment arisen from COVID-19 has also affected me at a personal level. And I have relatives and friends, some of whom are elderly, living in San Francisco Bay Area, who are afraid to go to the grocery store, take the public transport, or go for a leisurely walk around the neighborhood for fear of being harassed either verbally or physically. In a civilized society, no one should be afraid to go about doing things that they need to do for survival, to live a full and healthy life. This is what makes the virus of hate and racism accompanying COVID-19 so despicable and dangerous. The moral virus of hate and racism has been a part of the United States since its foundation, and anti-Asian racism has existed even before Chinese arrived in significant number in the mid-19th century. What COVID-19 has done is to bring to surface the sins of our past that we are not adequately dealt with. The continued portrays the Chinese and other Asians as perpetual foreigners and are seen as unassimilable to the American way of life. Among the nation frontline workers in hospital, Asian Americans represent 15% of physicians and 24 to 25% of registered nurses. Some have encountered verbal or physical harassment while taking the subway to and from work, and many have experienced rejections from the patient who requested to be treated by a non-Asian physician or nurse. In May 19 edition, Washington Post ran a story about Lucy Lee, a 28-year-old anesthesiology resident at Massachusetts General Hospital, who experienced verbal harassment from a stranger who followed her to the subway and discharged a profanity-laced racist outburst at her. Initially, she was stunned And later she was saddened and angered by the irony. And she said, I'm risking my own personal health and then to be vilified just because of what I look like. In San Fernando Valley, California, an Asian American teen ended up in emergency room after he was assaulted by bullies in his high school who accused him of having coronavirus. And one of those incidents took place in Sam's Club in Midland, Texas, where a 19-year-old Latino suspect stabbed 3 Burmese American family members, including a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, with the assumption that they were infecting people with coronavirus. I mean, you got to be a real sicko to stab a 2-year-old. This hate crime is also a case of racial profiling because the victims are not Chinese. Although the father and children who were attacked are Chen, an ethnic minority group from Burma, various English language report and news sharing on social media conflated Chen with Chinese. This blurring between nation and ethnicity show how Asian became a singular race in the United States, targeted and lumped together as scapegoats of xenophobia. The COVID-19 pandemic brought to the surface America's deep-seated racism against Asians that has been evidenced and documented throughout the Asian American history. The characterization of Chinese as yellow peril predates the arrival of Chinese immigrants to the U.S. in the mid-19th century. Even before the arrival of Chinese significant number, the American public already had a negative view of Chinese as opium addicts, depraved heathens, as well as carriers of disease and contagions. Now, I just realized I never make this bigger. I often do that. Okay. Anyway, so anyway, they are seen in a negative light, even though they show up. Initially, Chinese immigrants came in notable number in search for gold in California. Later, they were recruited to build western portion of the Transcontinental Railway. Destitute and uneducated, laborers from China were forced to live in an overcrowded urban area called Chinatown, which became associated with filth and immorality because early Chinatown had a thriving vice economy based on gambling, prostitution, and drugs. So it did not bode well for the Chinese migrant. For the Chinese migrant, when sensational media began reporting about Chinatown as a breeding ground for disease, depravity, and degradation. As the Chinese population grew in California, so did xenophobia and racism directed towards them. They were racialized as dog eaters. Come on. Sorry, this is very touchy. There's a racialized dog eater and other vermin like rats and mice. During the outbreak of smallpox in 1875 and bubonic plague in 1900, San Francisco officials blamed Chinese for unsanitary conditions that endanger public health, living condition. Chinese became easy scapegoat for the widespread xenophobia of the time. And after the completion of Transcontinental Railway, Chinese were accused of stealing jobs from white men, even though most of the jobs available to them at that time were the kind of jobs that women would do. And there were very few women in the West Coast. The Chinese men end up doing laundry and cooking. Chinese were seen as unassimilable, both racially and culturally, to the American way of life, unfair competitors who posed a threat to white laborers, which resulted in high tension between Chinese workers and settlers of European descent that eventually led to the enactment of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. This act constructed Chinese as permanent outsider who were barred from entering the US because of their race. In the 2018 pastoral letter against racism, Asian Americans are not mentioned with the exception of one sentence, and that one sentence reads, like the Irish and Italian, Chinese, Japanese, Mexican, and Puerto Rican, and attest to having been the target of racial ethnic prejudice in this country. This lumping together of white and non-white ethnic groups whose experiences are qualitatively different from each other fails to acknowledge the Irish and Italian have been folded into whiteness, while the latter four non-white ethnic groups are still seen as outsiders. There's also a missed opportunity that Open Wide Our Heart, the pastoral letter against racism, makes no reference to Encountering Christ in Harmony, and vice versa. Encountering Christ in Harmony, a pastoral response to Asian and Pacific Islanders, does a fairly good job for a small booklet presenting Asian Pacific Islander in terms of identity, generation, leadership, cultural encounter, and dialogue in faith. Harmony spent a seemingly obligatory, slightly over page addressing racism experience of Asian and Pacific Islander in the US, and many pages of sidebar providing demographic data, some history and cultural practices. It brought some important points, like for example, the idea that the model minority myth has made Asian American and Pacific Islanders invisible in the politics of US racial discourses. It has a large sidebar defining racism from 1979 pastoral letter and a quote from the late Cardinal Francis George on racism, but no reference to any of the works done by Asian American scholar and theologian on the same topic. Perhaps due to the page limitation, Asian American history become essentialized into the worst form tokenism, the mention of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and the internment of Japanese during World War II within the same sentence while providing no context or explanation. An anti-racist move would have been to acknowledge the complicity of Irish Catholics and the action of Catholic Church to the enactment of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Chinese immigrants, almost all of whom are Catholics, and were badly discriminated on the East Coast, in part because of their faith, of their religion, became aware of the physical whiteness was more salient when juxtaposed next to the Chinese on the West Coast. Unfortunately, instead of living out the Catholic faith, the Irish took on the mantle of whiteness on the West Coast and treated Chinese just as badly as they were treated by the Anglos on the East Coast. And this is a sad commentary that often repeated in US history about how the oppressed became the oppressor. This is even more gloomy when history tells us that the Irish and the Chinese came to the US about the same time. The Irish could have used their newly acquired voting power to include Chinese immigrants who experienced they should be able to empathize with, since neither group was fully accepted in American society at that time. Instead, the working class Irish formed trade unions, fraternity organizations, and courted politicians to exclude the Chinese. The infamous xenophobic slogan of Dennis Kearney and the Working Men's Party, that the Chinese must go, is a case in point. After white workers on the West Coast, many of whom were Irish, went on strike in the late 1870s, venture capitalists and in the mining and railroad companies recruited Chinese and used them as pawns to break the demands of the labor union. Instead of challenging the capitalists for playing the race card, white workers took their racist anger against the Chinese. This and other form of nativist racism resulted in mob violence against Chinese, and they were beaten, lynched, their abodes were ransacked, and those who managed to escape alive were driven off Portland, Seattle, and many other cities on the West Coast. Although many American Catholics in the United States were opposed to the Chinese Exclusion Act, among the strongest supporters of this Exclusion Act were the Irish, as well as the Knights of Labor, an organization with an overwhelming Catholic membership. They did everything in their power to ensure the Chinese were barred from entering the US. During this time, in the late 19th century, the Catholic Church in the US was very much an immigrant church. The founding of the National Catholic World Council, the forerunner of the National Catholic Welfare Conference, which has been known since 2001 USCCB, United States Catholic Conference of Catholic Bishops, was still over 3 decades away. That is, the founding of Catholic, National Catholic World Council. That was 3 decades away. Even though the Catholic Church had no organization to lobby against this act, it could still have taken an openly critical stand on this issue in support of many American Catholics who opposed this act, and in opposition to Irish Catholics who advocated for the passage of this act. By remaining silent to the Exclusion Act that equates Chinese with lepers, prostitutes, and mentally ill. And these are 3 groups that were before 1882 that could not come to the US. In 1882, Chinese were added to 3 groups. The Catholic Church was complicit in the sin of omission because it failed to live up to its social teaching in recognizing and acknowledging the dignity of the largest group of human beings on this planet. By not acknowledging this complicity, it also minimizes Cardinal George's word on racism. This sort of anti-racist move in admitting our own complicity cannot be overestimated. When it comes to racial matters, it's better to be proactive rather than reactive. We must point out that the faults of the past, we have to point them out so that we don't repeat them again. But we must also keep in mind not to judge the past based on the vantage point history of our time. Without minimizing the sinful deeds, we need to keep in mind that the Irish, the Italian, other European groups, as well as the Catholic Church, the late Victorian era, did not have the view of history, understanding of diverse people and culture of the world that we have in the 21st century. We, however, ought to know better. The Bishop of 2018 pastoral letter and pastoral response challenged Catholics and all people of goodwill to reckon with our sins of racism in order to form a just society in which the inherent dignity of all people is respected as a fundamental God-given right. Thank you. I don't know how much time you left, but that's it.
Okay, you stop sharing your screen and then we'll get a better picture of you, and we'll bring Sarah on the computer so that she can ask you some of the questions that have come through. And first, just let me say thank you. I am humbled to learn so much, and I'm also pretty disturbed by a lot of what I heard as well. Sarah.
Hey, great, thanks. Thank you, Father Shea. I think I'll start with this first question, which is, what are some methods for pastoral ministry to accompany Asian American and Pacific Islander Catholics who are the victims of this rhetoric from politicians, or some of the examples that you shared of the people who this emerging racism and discrimination from COVID-19 experience? How can we accompany people as you experience these horrific things?
One of the things that I share is that get a sense of, let's say you're on a subway train. If somebody is picking on Asian Americans because of their race, because during this COVID-19 time, get a sense if this person is violent or not. You can kind of tell. If he's not, if the trains, if people in the past are mostly white and you're white, say something. I mean, he's less likely to pick on you than to pick on this person of color. Being allied with the person of color when you are safe because of your whiteness, surrounded by white passenger. Less likely he's going to do something to you. But standing up for this person verbally, I'm not talking about physically, can put a stop to whatever he's doing or she's doing. But in terms of pastoral in the parish setting, I think it's just lending open ear, willing to listen to people who are going through that kind of experience. and just having a welcoming attitude. And I think that that will help.
I also think we heard you loud and clear in these questions about this being in a rock and a hard place, about celebrating the various cultures and the pictures you showed us of these beautiful celebrations, but then also not wanting to reduce, not wanting to perpetuate stereotypes. And I think there was a question about, where do we go to maybe experience and learn these beautiful celebrations, but at the same time being mindful of what you said about that. How can we celebrate but keep that balance in mind and be respectful, not reduced to tokenism?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you hang out with Asian American, the kind of experience that we go through, and it's if you're in a parish that Asian American population, you might have some kind of program for them to come in a safe place where they can share these experiences, and have somebody who can guide them, to willing to listen to what they are sharing, and not so much impose our idea of what is the hospitality, what's welcoming. So like I said, one of our sense of welcoming maybe have the multicultural ethnic celebration. That's appropriate. Yeah, we need that, but you also need the other side. How do you express the real experience that Asian American actually living? We don't walk around with our costume, with our cultural costume, but oftentimes we are treated as such, because people always ask us, where are you really from? Because they see us as if we are back in Asia. They never see us right in front of them. That's the part that we don't do well. That we need to bring that out a little more, especially within the church setting and celebration.
Great, thank you. I think we're at about 4 minutes, so I'm going to see if I can find some question in our last. So I do have a question here. Do you think the church needs to acknowledge, the nuclear bombing of Japan in 1945 as some way as a sin of the past and a step in making parishioners aware of this event, kind of leading forward and contributing to the conversation about peaceful, nonviolent international community atmosphere?
Yeah, I think it's safe to be on the side of complicity in these kind of thing, and then pretending like it never happened, or we have nothing to do with it. It's much better to come out and say, we should have spoken. The church as a whole should have spoken against, that's the Chinese Exclusion Act, but rather than have this thing come out, someday with all the people, the activists and the scholars, again, write articles, showing what the church has done in the past. We come out, right before anybody does that, we say, we did it long before you guys even mentioned it. I think that speaks volumes.
Great. I think, we only have a couple minutes. I want to leave you with a moment if you have any final thoughts. I know that there were several people that were sort of interested in hearing you go in a little bit more about the Marian devotion. I don't know that we have loads of time, but I just wanted to let you know that was something of interest.
Well, the Marian devotion, you can find it. I give Lynn the article by Jonathan Tan, and so it's a short article. Perfect. You can read that. And a lot of stuff that I mentioned today, you can be found in my short autobiographical theological reflection, which I also give to Lynn, and that just came out last month. So you can look at those two things. They're not that big; they're very short, and they're packed with information stuff.
That's terrific. Yeah, and we will be sending out links as we always do and posting them after the webinar's conclusion. So thank you for that. And if you just have any other final thoughts, I'll invite you to share them. And thank you so much.
No, no, I just thank you for the opportunity to for me to share something about the Asian American experience. And one of the things that the Encountering Christ got it right, and whoever wrote that particular sentence know what modern minority is about. That the modern minority made us invisible in the politics of racial discourses. You look at it, every time we talk about poverty and race, it's always black and brown. And that's okay. We need to focus on black and brown because they suffer the most from poverty and race. But we also, Asian American also suffer well, racialized differently. We suffer differently. And our experience never come out because of the modern minority myth. People assume we got it made. And we don't need help. And that's where the people who get it the worst are the Hmong, the Burmese, those who are not modern minority, they are refugee community. And they don't have the help that they need to succeed. The people who fit the modern minority mode are people who are children of immigrants. That's because of our immigration law that prefer the brightest and the wealthiest. We are the brain drain type of immigration law. You have the people are rich and bright, or smart, educated. They want the kids to be educated too, and they prepare the kids to make sure they do well in colleges. That's why there are so many Asian American kids in Ivy League colleges. It didn't happen by accident. It has something to do with immigration law, and they came in later after the modern minority myth had already been established, and they fit into the mode. And so we have the problem there.
At this time, I'm gonna thank you, Father. I'm reading through all these chat messages, and so many people are just so grateful for your presence, for your presentation, discovering this gem of knowledge that we have in the diocese that we didn't realize it. So I'm just so happy to have met you, for you to have joined us today. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
To our participants who are out there, I'm going to let you know about 2 upcoming events. We will not be having a racism webinar series in October. However, we do have a webinar that we are doing on human trafficking on October 5th. And then our annual gathering, which is typically our annual dinner, is going to be held virtual this year. And you are all invited to that, talking about racism. So please join us for that event. Thank you all for attending and being such faithful participants in our webinar series. Good night.
Good night.